Hi folks, Rich Johnston here from Garrick's Camera House, Maroochydore, and today I'm in the studio with Bob Walpole. How are you, Bob?
I'm absolutely first class and top of the line.
That's great to hear, mate, that's great to hear. Folks, we're going to talk a little bit about Bob's photography, what he's been into and some of the gear that he uses. But Bob, introduce yourself, please.
Okay, I think the best way to describe me and my work is that my background has been in advertising. So therefore, I was lucky enough to work with a number of wonderful commercial photographers. And when you work with those sort of people, it's true to say that a little bit of it rubs off over time. So when I rewired, that's retired when you've got a bit of work to do.
I like that, I like that.
So when I rewired, I was still doing a little bit of consulting work, but at the end of the day, I really needed to get back into those little creative areas that I've always loved. And photography was one of those. And I'm old enough to be able to tell you that my first camera was a Brownie box camera by Kodak.
Right.
So, and that was given to me when I was about 9 by my father. And since then, I've quietly progressed through all kinds of brands. And if you've heard of Voigtlander and Minolta, which of course is now Sony, etc., etc. So I've found myself wanting to continue with my photographic work over these last 12 years since I've gone into new roles.
Yeah, well, that's great advice too, Bob. I've been a working professional photographer all of my life, but I would say some of my most creative endeavours and things that I've done with my children have been around that photography, and it's great. Well, it's great therapy. It's great bonding. There's great mateship amongst photographers.
Very much so.
It is. It's a really wonderful hobby. So, Bob, I've met you on a number of occasions.
You have,
but
over many years.
Can I tell you one of my earliest memories was you would be one of the very first adopters of the mirrorless camera system.
Absolutely right.
I think you were probably one of the first cabs off the rank in our organisation.
That's right. That is true. That's very true. I was working with Canon full frame, and I found that over time, and I went through all of the 5Ds, and I got to a point where I thought these things really are quite heavy, and Sony made the decision to go with full frame mirrorless.
Yep, it was a bold decision, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
First to market.
Absolutely. And I thought, well, being a marketing guy, I couldn't help to be sucked in. Because there's no sucker like a salesman.
Yeah, sure.
So I said, look, let's do this. So I hedged my bets. And I had a 5D, I had a Mark III and a Mark IV, and I bought a Sony A7.
Right, and that was in the real early days of this, and Sony is the mother of this invention. They are the research and development kings, and of course, their cameras today are absolutely, at the top of their game.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And currently, Bob, what are you shooting with these days?
Well, I'm now shooting a Sony A1,
very nice.
which I was very fortunate to have Rich organise that for me. And I shoot A7R4, which I primarily use for landscapes because of its 61 megapixels. And I've got tucked away still in my dehumidifier a Sony A9, which is a fabulous camera.
That is a nice camera.
And I also have which again, courtesy of Camera House.
66?
66.
600?
Yeah, 6600.
So you're an absolute brand advocate for Sony then, aren't you? They've gone from strength to strength.
I've gone through almost every Sony Alpha series camera since their inception, pretty close to nearly 7 years ago. So bit by bit, I've moved from A7, A7R, and kept going all the way through. But the revelation was really the autofocus system on Sony compared to a couple of the other brands, of which have finally caught up. But Sony's autofocusing system is just extraordinary.
It is. It absolutely is. It's leading in technology for sure.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough to go to a lot of these seminars when they first released these cameras, and when they first brought out what they called their bird eye detect, I thought, well, how successful could that be? Because they're such an erratic, fast-moving subject, and I'm no expert at all on that. But it was astronomical. Do you find you use that particular mode?
Oh, of course.
You do?
Of course, and that's one of the very reasons why I bought the Sony A1.
Right.
The Sony A9, by the way, has animal and human eye focus, but it's not as successful as the Sony A1, which has those two plus bird eye focus. So if you're a wildlife photographer, any of those Sonys from about the A7R3 up has what I call sticky autofocus. It literally sticks on to the item that you're trying to photograph, particularly when you're talking wildlife.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, great endorsement too for
Yeah, and they don't pay me a thing,
No. But it is. It's just the right tool for the job, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just the right tool.
Yeah.
Bob, I want to talk about your photos, and don't be offended, but what I have been and seen of Bob Walpole's photography, I see lots and lots of beautiful photos of the birds, like coming in here behind us.
Yeah.
And I was doing a little bit of research because I knew you were coming into the studios.
Sure.
And I was even looking through your Facebook feed, and I saw this landscape image. And I had to have a little chuckle, Bob, because one of your friends in that thread said, "This is a wonderful shot, Bob, but where's the bird?"
That's right.
and I guess you've carved yourself a niche
right.
out there with these beautiful images of birds.
Yeah.
But you do have a spectacular range of landscape photos.
Yes.
Can you run me through a few of those now, Bob, and just tell me a little bit about where they are and the style?
Look, I think for fellow photographers out there that are looking at this video, there are two genres that I have found to be ideal for me. One is wildlife, and because of the recent couple of years with COVID, that tends to stop you from going to some of the wonderful exotic places that I've been to, and I'm talking about places like the Pantanal in Brazil, some of the amazing national parks in India, and of course Africa, which I've been to 6 or 7 times through East Africa and Namibia. So I should mention I've also been to the Antarctic and the Arctic. This is sounding like a geography lesson.
You must feel landlocked now, Bob, at the moment.
Well, amazingly, there are some wonderful landscapes and birds in Queensland.
Oh, absolutely.
And I've been putting some time into places like southwest Queensland and far north Queensland, of which there are some amazing birds.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the landscape is very special. But having said that, I've been winning some really interesting awards and what I call gongs, both nationally and internationally, for my birds. But of recent times, my minimalist landscape, and I'll say that again, minimalist landscape, because these are not just the normal landscape images that people see. These tend to be, because of where I shoot, mono. They tend to be mono. The colours are mono. I almost don't have to change it to black and white.
Yeah.
They can be, they are mono just when you see them.
Organically.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I shoot these recent images, which I've done a whole portfolio of, and I've been tutoring around southeast Queensland recently on how to shoot minimalist landscapes.
Because it sounds easy, doesn't it?
It sounds very easy.
Sounds too easy.
Yeah. And in fact, I will digress slightly by making a comment that I've often heard, and I'm sure Camera House would never say these things, but you can just about shoot anything with any camera, and it's really down to the person behind the camera. Well, I wonder whether that is strictly true, because if you buy a $500 camera and you buy a $5,000 camera, I've got to tell you, you get what you pay for.
Sure.
And when you're dealing with a camera like a Sony A1, which is, I have to say, far in excess of that $5,000 comment that I made, those sorts of cameras certainly aid the image maker.
Yes.
And it helps you deliver what you've got in your mind's eye. So when I went to Japan in February 2020, now just consider, this is right at the beginning of COVID.
Yes. Oh.
So I made the decision. We didn't know about any changes at that time. I went and I found a Japanese guide who would take me up into an area called Hokkaido in Japan, which is the northern island. And I wanted to shoot winter landscapes, in particular the most minimalist I could find. And I was fortunate enough to be able to shoot some wonderful, wonderful images. It was extremely cold, because we're talking sometimes -11, and I'm out there trudging through the snow, sometimes right up to my thighs. But wow, when you look at the back of your camera after you've spent an hour freezing and you say, I've done it, I'm certain I've done it.
Yes, that's a great feeling, isn't it?
It is.
It doesn't happen near often enough, though, does it? All right, let's have a look at a couple of these, Bob.
Sure.
Okay, tell me about this one. This is probably the epitome of this genre, the style.
It certainly is. Look, again, minimalism. I'm a great believer in the 3 Ps. People might say, what the heck are 3 Ps? Well, I'll tell you. Well, my 3 Ps are different to everybody else, because Bob Walpole does it his way. Remember the Frank Sinatra song, I did it my way? Well, mate, just take Frank Sinatra out and put in Bob Walpole. Because that's how I do things. I do it my way. Now, the 3 Ps that I use are persistence, patience, and passion.
Great.
Because if you do not have any one, but more importantly, all 3 of those, your photography will not deliver that wow factor.
Yeah.
Now, you can have all the technology in the world, and it certainly helps, but you've got to have those other little elements, those 3 Ps, to deliver the creativity that is required. Now, in this case, we drove along and I spied this, and it has been shot by others, but I just couldn't believe this clump of trees sitting on the top of a hill in a snow-clad field.
It's absolutely
and we got out of the car. It was snowing at the time, and I walked across that field to get that shot. And others that have probably seen very similar will know that when you're shooting minimalist photography, everybody seems to think that there's nothing else around, there's just the element that you're wanting to shoot. Well, that's not strictly true, because there are fences, there are grasses, there are tractors, there are all sorts of things in the way. And I've often said in part of my little group of lectures that I've been doing around southeast Queensland, I tell people that the crop tool is my friend.
Is your friend. Because I guess then any of those things that you're talking about, those additional components in a minimalist landscape is distraction. Is this?
Absolutely right. And you've got it in one, Rich. What you've got to do is deconstruct. And when you deconstruct an image, and that's what I do, I look at it and I compose it in such a way that I remove all other elements as best I can and concentrate on that one single dark matter that delivers that special look. And the shot that you've just put up is a typical example.
Terrific, terrific. All right, can we have a look at another couple here, Bob? Now, this one called The Farmhouse.
It is.
I love that.
And so you should, Rich, because that won a gong in the Photographic Society of America.
Yeah, everything there just works so well, doesn't it?
And here's another thing that people may or may not understand about shooting minimalist photography, and that is the kinds of lenses that you might choose.
Okay.
So
good point.
Yeah. So I use. Look, I've got a number of lenses, 16 to 35s, 24 to 105s, etc., 100 to 400, and so on and so on. But for minimalist work and landscape work in particular, there are two lenses, and I know people may argue, but there are two lenses that I use almost exclusively. My go-to lens is the 24 to 105. 24 is pretty wide. And
on a full frame? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but in this case, the image that you're looking at, I shot with a 100 to 400.
Is that right?
And the reason I shot with a 100 to 400 is because that farmhouse was miles away.
Right.
It was right down in a valley.
Okay.
And it was snowing, and I needed to get down there. A 24 to 105 would not do it, even if I cropped like crazy.
Yes.
With a 61 megapixel camera, which was the A7R4 used for this shot. A 100 to 400 gave me that close-up feel.
And it's also got that compression. Now that you've pointed that out, I can see that. That is, it's a lovely shot.
Yeah.
Can we have a look at another?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so here we're going to talk about using what's available to you rather than trying to escape it.
Yep.
And I should imagine here this is what we would call a lead-in line.
Absolutely.
So that fence line, and the eye, it's carrying it through to the mid-ground, up to the thicket of trees. And I tell you what I do love about this image is the way that the horizon just blends
across
into nothing.
Yes.
And that's a wonderful little happy part of that image when you go, now I'm completely lost in the abyss.
Yeah, well, and that's very much part of it. When I'm shooting, I try to blend, and I do this not always in my software. I try to look at it through the lens. I try to get everything right first in camera, because that saves a lot of time. And I'll be honest with you, I'd rather be out there, photographing than sitting behind a computer.
Yeah.
So I try to get it right first up. Now, the comment you just made about sky and the land. There's hardly any difference in this image between those two elements. And I think that's what delivers the interest to this particular image. By the way, this image is sold many times. Prints of this are sold many times.
I should imagine.
So yeah.
Very nice, very nice, Bob. Is there any other, like, are you obviously on a tripod or are you hand holding your shots?
Gee, Rich, I'm glad you asked that, because this is where Bob does it his way yet again. I saw photographers in Japan, not far from where I was shooting, and there they were stuck in the snow with their tripods, and they're working away at 100 ISO, and I'm saying to myself, this is not how I shoot. I do not shoot with a tripod.
Okay.
Right? I shoot handheld, and one of the things to do when you're not using a tripod is you move your ISO up. With Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras, gee, they should pay me, shouldn't they? With Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras, I can tell you they can handle enormous amounts of ISO. That means
without creating the digital noise
in
the file.
Very little noise and grain. In fact, I've actually shot birds in rainforest. Would you believe it? 32,000 ISO, and they're very acceptable. And
now I've had similar experiences, and
Absolutely.
I think that is one of the benefits, folks. If you're looking at going into this newer technology, into the mirrorless cameras, what you may have at the moment, if you're shooting with a DSLR, most of us would have been questionable whether or not we would push that ISO above 1600 and still deem that image as a commercially usable image.
Correct.
Well, I've been shooting weddings on the Z7 in the Nikon cam.
Good camera.
Wonderful camera, and that was one of the very first things that I realised is I was using my flash a lot less. I was using a much higher ISO and commercially usable photos, 6400 ISO, no problem. So it is, it's wonderful. This new technology is really great.
It is, and I think this is, Sony might have been the people that started that full frame mirrorless, but others have now come in and almost as good.
I'm sure Sony should be paying you.
But I'll get to another point. And that is that when I do use the handheld system, you need to understand I shoot probably, if I shoot aperture priority, by the way, almost exclusively, and with a Sony camera, and I'm sure some of the others do the same, you can actually set your minimum shutter speed.
Correct.
And if you do that with ISO Auto, you can actually get it really rolling. So I might set it at say 1/2000th of a second. Now, when you do that, when you're photographing, I like to shoot 3 or 4 at the same time. In other words, I don't just shoot a single photograph, because often that first photograph, if you're hand holding, may, even with the best stabilisation in the world, there may be the minutest amount of shake. Sure. So when you shoot a bracket of 3 or 4, that second and third shot are usually as sharp as a tack.
Yeah, right.
So most of these have been shot at 1600 ISO, 800,000, all those, and I've got the speed right up. Another point to make about when you're shooting handheld, have a look at the lens, and if you've got a 24-105, and Rich knows all this stuff, but if you've got a 105, then the minimum you should be shooting your shutter speed at is 100 or 105. So if you've got a 100 to 400 slapped onto your Sony A1,
and you're shooting at 400,
the very minimum you should be is 400
off a second. So,
5%.
so what we're talking about there, Bob, is we shoot the inverse of the focal length. So trying to match the focal length with your shutter speed handheld.
Spot on.
Yeah, and that is also with all of the technology of your in-body stabilisation or your optic image stabilisation, and across the brands, of course. But that is great advice.
Absolutely right. And when you analyse all of that and you put that together, in fact, I'll be honest with you and tell you that if I'm out at 400, and therefore 400 would be the shutter speed, would be the right thing to do, I'll often creep it right up to sometimes even double that, so that I've got a fast shutter speed, so that it keeps that sharp as a tack look.
So that really is great advice, Bob. So that shooting the inverse of the focal length. Give away your tripod, you're probably going to get a lot more shots too. And this is something, folks, that I've had this experience myself. You tend to take a tripod, you find the spot that you want to be in, and then you spend 15 or 20 minutes there and you come home with 100 photographs of the same scene, all very much the same. But without that tripod, you change your angles, you change your distance to your subject, you come home with a multitude of options, and quite often the one that I pick, the one that you see on Facebook, is not the one that I went to shoot.
That's right.
It's the one when I got bored and I moved over to the left, or I crept over, or I saw something else. Yeah. Great advice. All right, Bob, so shooting a landscape, you've given us your method there. Now, what about when you shoot your birds? What's the method when you're shooting your birds?
Oh, well...
probably one of the hardest.
If I told you, I'd have to shoot you.
Well, we're going to find out. Give us this much.
Okay. Again, as I do with my minimalist landscapes, I do shoot ISO auto, and I know that's a contentious issue for some people, but many of my birds I shoot are in flight. So when I'm shooting in flight, sometimes they're in the sky, sometimes they're, there's bush in the distance. And so what I do is I shoot ISO auto, I shoot aperture priority, I bump my shutter speed up on that minimum shutter speed system. Are you ready for this? I go right up to 0.004 of a second.
Gotcha.
Now, people will say, well, you don't, well, you do. Trust me, you do. When those birds, particularly small birds, when they are flying hell for leather,
yes,
I got to tell you, 0.005 of a second. If you want to freeze that bird in flight, and you will still get slight blurring around the tail and around the wings, but as long as that head and eye are super sharp, and I use f7.1.
Okay. So give you a decent depth of field. Now we're talking primarily when the bird is in flight. Yes.
When they're in flight.
Yes.
And by the way, I use the Sony A1, of course, but I use a 200 to 600 millimeter lens.
That's a lovely lens.
It's a beautiful lens, and it's actually quite good value. I use that almost exclusively on birds.
Right. So how does that then change if we're talking about shooting a bird that's stationary? Are we trying to get that blurred background, or is there a change between your thinking when a bird's not in flight?
Yes. With the particular camera that I use, it has a range of focus areas, and you can shoot wide, zone, expandable spot, small spot, etc., right down to the bottom on the little dial. And I've set my camera up so that I can very quickly change without taking the camera away from my face, from my eye. I can change it by the little button on the top to quickly down to tracking.
Oh, yes.
And I can shoot, for instance, if the bird is in a tree and there are a lot of leaves around it, I'll go and I'm thinking that it might fly. I will go to tracking small.
Tracking small spots.
Small spot.
Gotcha.
And it's still ISO auto. I'm still using the same shutter speed because who knows, they're so erratic.
That's right.
And that's why I do it that way.
Yeah. No, that's great, Bob. So let's just go through. I want to have a look at a couple of your bird images for you, Bob. Anything here that is special or dear to your heart that you'd like to talk about?
There's probably heaps in there. The eastern ground parrot, which was not flying, and it's an endangered bird. You won't see too many of those around Australia. In fact, this particular bird was shot just north of where I live, and I live in the Noosa area, and there's a national park up there called Calusa, and I'd heard on the grapevine that people had seen one or two of these. There's hardly any left, and so I was fortunate enough to quietly get a photograph. Because of my background is in marketing, and I'm a bit of an extrovert, as if you didn't tell. When I have a camera in my hand, Rich, I turn quiet.
Okay.
And it's all about the quiet and the calm. And when I'm around people who are talking, particularly with birds, I have to walk away.
Yes, sure.
So that is what happened with this particular bird. As a matter of interest, I've been published in many magazines around the world. British magazines, outdoor magazines have published my work. Australian photographic magazines have published my work. And recently, the current publication of BirdLife magazine has featured this bird, my photograph, on their front cover.
I saw that, Bob. Yeah, and that is a great feeling when you get that sort of recognition, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is indeed.
And so, Bob, when you're taking the photographs of these birds, are you tied into any sort of conservation efforts, or do you report when you see? You do.
I do. Look, I think it's important, particularly with the rare birds. You need to let people like BirdLife know about it, and they're a national body, and you'll see a lot of images that I've photographed all around the world, and some of those birds are endangered. Of recent times, I've shot a Victoria's rifle bird in Far North Queensland, and they are really, really difficult to get to keep still. But I did. If you have a look at some of these, that's a regent bowerbird, and they are very quick, and you don't know which way they're going to fly. But if you use the method that I've suggested earlier, you need to lock on to that tracking. By the way, in my camera, there's a whole series of settings that you actually need to change from default. And once you understand that, you can move all of these there are only minor things to do in camera, but once you do that, you end up with this very sticky autofocus that literally locks onto the bird. In fact, with the Sony A1, I would get probably 95% of the burst
strike rate
in focus.
Is that right? That's amazing.
Yeah,
that's terrific. Yeah, really good.
Yeah.
All right, Bob. What about? Is there anything else here that you'd like to talk to the audience about?
Look, I think any of the bird photography. There's a good example. I think it's an Amazonian kingfisher, shot in the wilds of the Pantanal in Brazil about 3 years ago. It was a very difficult place to get to, and you really have to be conscious of your surroundings. And it's the human surroundings you've got to be conscious of.
Yeah.
So, but I went there specifically to be able to shoot jaguar and ocelot, which I shot. But of course, being a bird photographer, I couldn't help but shoot the birds in the along the rivers, and freeze frame them as they hit the water. So yeah, some magic times were had photographing those birds.
Absolutely. All right, Bob. Mate, let's just recap for the folks.
Sure.
So you're a Sony advocate. Now, you've mentioned two bodies pretty exclusively. The A1 camera. Now, that is your go-to tool for the bird photography.
For any wildlife.
200 to 600 mil lens.
Correct.
And don't forget, like when you get that camera, folks, the inbuilt focus system set to default. It's up to you. You're the photographer. You're the artist, and you're an absolute advocate that you get it. Once you get it right, Bob, that camera will not let you down. But you've got a second body that you're using for your landscape photography, and that is the A7R4, and that is the higher megapixel camera, allowing you to do those large size prints. You mentioned a 16 to 35 mil lens. I think most landscape photographers would sort of have one of those in their kit.
They do.
24-105, but your 100 to 400. Terrific for that compression. And I guess, do you use that for doing panoramics and stitch together images with your big tally?
This is where Bob will tell you the truth. I'm not a great Photoshop user. Lightroom does almost everything that I need to do. Now there are other software programs that will probably do very similar, but I use Lightroom exclusively, and I just don't need Photoshop.
Right.
Unless it's something very specific that I have to do. And it might be a cloning requirement, or
that's not featured on the Lightroom or something. Yeah, no, that's great. All right, Bob. Now, you were also a member of a camera club up here called the Noosa Camera Group.
Noosa Photo Club.
Noosa Photo Club.
Yeah,
sorry.
I was president of that one for a while and on the committee for a long time. And also I'm now what they call, we don't have a president in this next one, it's called the In Focus Photo Group.
They're a great group of guys.
Yeah, we had you along.
Yeah, I had a meal and shared a meal with everyone. Very friendly group too, by the way, folks. If you're worried about getting into a photo group, because some of them are competitive, there's no doubt about it. But if you're going more for the social and the camaraderie side, definitely look those guys up. They have is it a fortnightly?
We have monthly, second Tuesday of the month in Focus, and it's really a get together of like-minded people, and we learn from each other, and we have guest speakers like Rich who's been along. He did a wonderful drone story and a number of other items that Camera House have got, and I would suggest that if you want to grow in your photography and you want to get really serious, then it doesn't hurt to be a member of one of these sorts of groups.
I would agree with that, 100%. And you get some good critique as well. And there's a difference between critique and criticism. So you've got to go with an open mind when you go to a lot of these camera associations.
But you're right. You've got to start somewhere. Photo clubs essentially they tend to be competitive because they have these competitions that you enter your piece in. Now, sometimes you're going to feel a bit hurt when your work comes up against others and you get low scores. Well, that's life. You've got to learn. So local judges or judges in general need to take into account that they're photo clubs and they're learning. So they should not be too critical of them.
And I guess if you have that experience too, folks, remember that's just another person's opinion, right?
Well,
I think you've got to shake a lot of that off.
Absolutely right. As with all art, photography, it's subjective. At the end of the day, you can have a look at one great photo and another photo, and people have a very different opinion. I've won awards around the world with photos that a local judge has given me a low score for.
Yep, how about that? Bob, thanks for being part of our photographic community, mate. Right. It's really great to have you here in the Garrick studio. Folks, don't forget you'll find Bob's Instagram page. Is it Bob Shots? Is that the right
Bob's
one?
Hot Shots.
Bob's Hot Shots is the Instagram, just under Bob Walpole on Facebook.
Correct.
Any other social media type?
No, keep it simple.
All right, folks. Well, don't forget, if you've got a bird photographer or a landscape photographer that's a friend, will you please share and like our video? Check our social media pages out on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, folks. Thanks, Bob.
Bye.
Bye.